My son opened the door to his own house, looked past me at the street, and said, "Dad, I really need you to go. Gillian's parking the car right now." The November rain was the kind that doesn't fall so much as wait for you. It had been on my coat since Truro. Inside, through the gap in the door, I could see my granddaughter Hazel sitting at the dining table with a book open face down on the tablecloth the way her grandmother used to do it, like she was saving her place in two things at once. She looked up, she saw me. Then my son Declan said the sentence I'm going to hear for the rest of my life. "You have to stop doing this, Dad. I can't keep carrying you. I have been working on the water since I was 11 years old. I have pulled trap in November gales. I have not slept for 36 hours during a good December run. I have carried things that would have broken other men before breakfast. But in 67 years I have never, not once, asked Declan Callahan for a single dollar. The only person who had been quietly carried for the past 11 years was him. He just didn't know it. I didn't argue. I bent down and set a tin tackle box on his front step. Inside it was a folder. Beneath that folder was something I'd been meaning to give him for 2 years and hadn't found the way. I said, "Read the folder first, but before you do anything with it, look underneath." He said, "Dad, what is this?" Not a question, the tone of a man opening a bill in someone else's name. I said, "It's yours," and I walked back to my truck. In the side mirror I watched my son standing in his doorway in the rain looking at a tackle box like a man who'd just been handed a live thing he didn't recognize. My name is Roy Callahan. I'm 67 years old and I'm a fisherman, specifically lobster. We run out of Pictou County in Nova Scotia, and we have for 81 years. My grandfather got his first license in 1943. My father expanded the operation. I expanded it again. We've got 38 traps now. That's what's left after I sold some licenses over the years. And a processing shed down at the wharf that my father built in 1967 out of whatever he could find, which in Pictou County in 1967 was a great deal of second-hand lumber and stubbornness. I know what I look like. I'm going to tell you, because it matters for what comes next. I'm not tall. My right hand doesn't fully close from a rope burn in 2001. My jacket is an old Stanfield's I've been wearing since Declan was in high school, and there is no amount of washing that gets the smell of brine and diesel and wet rope out of it. Not because I haven't tried, but because after 40 years it lives in the fibers. You spend long enough on the water, and you bring the water back with you and it stays. Declan told me once, maybe 5 years ago, I'd come up to Toronto to visit the grandkids and he was driving me somewhere. He said, "Dad, is that your jacket from the truck, or is that the one you had on when you got here?" That's it. That's all. 6 words, not cruel. Politely confused, the way you'd be confused if someone brought the outside inside. I said, "This is the jacket." And we went wherever we were going and we didn't talk about it. I've thought about those 6 words probably 300 times since. If you've ever had someone make you gently aware that you are the smell in the room and then had to sit across from them for 2 hours, pretending it didn't happen, you already know the thing I'm trying to tell you, and I'm sorry. I married Marion Beaton in 1981, 41 years. She ran the books, she ran the processing shed, she ran me, and she was the smartest person I've ever stood next to. She died in April 2022, a Tuesday morning, standing at the intake bench in the shed sorting through the overnight catch. Heart attack. She was 65. I was at the far end of the shed, and my dock hand Shirley came to the door and said my name once, and I knew by the way she said it. I'm going to come back to that shed. Everything in this story ends up back there. We had 2 kids. Willa, who's 43 now and works as a large animal vet out in Kelowna, BC. And Declan, who's 40 and lives in Toronto and runs a brand strategy agency called Northmark Creative. Declan's the reason we're here, and I want to be honest about something before I say the harder things. Declan was the good one, not sentiment, that's just what I observed. He was the one who sat quietly when I needed quiet, who carried things without being asked, who at 12 years old used to come down to the wharf on Saturday mornings, just to be near the work even though he hated getting his hands dirty. Nobody arrives at a front door like that without something having gone sideways along the way. I think I know what it was, and I've never told him I know. When Declan was 16, I had a buyer from Halifax come down to the shed to look at a load we were putting together for export. I dealt with him 9 years. He looked at my catch, he looked at my shed, and he offered me a number that was an insult dressed up as a handshake. And I took it because it was the 3rd week of the run and I needed to move product. And Declan was standing by the door, 16 years old. I watched him watch that exchange, and I watched something cross his face, and it wasn't anger at the buyer. It was embarrassment at me, for taking it. I have thought about that afternoon the way you think about the moment just before an accident. If I'd turned to him afterward and said one sentence, "That's what it costs to feed people," and I'd do it again. I think it might have gone differently. I didn't say anything. I stacked the bins. Declan went home. He went to Dalhousie, then Toronto, and then he built Northmark Creative. And here is the part that I love in the way you love something that also hurts. Declan's firm does brand storytelling for heritage food companies, fishing families, small batch preserves, multi-generational farms. He builds them a narrative about roots and craft and hands and salt air and soil, and he charges very good money for it, and he is genuinely skilled at it. My son sells authenticity for a living, and in 11 years he has never once put his father's operation in a pitch deck. Not a photograph, not a line. 4 generations of fishing in Pictou County, and it has never appeared in a single presentation. Not because he hid it, he just never thought it was worth anything. He married Gillian, who's an urban planner and who I actually like. I want to be clear about that because people always want a villain in the wife, and Gillian is not it. She's from Money and Rosedale and she doesn't think about it, and she has been perfectly decent to me every time I've been in a room with her. Her mother, Beverly, is another matter. We'll get there. They have 2 kids. Hazel, who's 13 and reads the way Marion read, 3 books at once, all of them face down on different pieces of furniture, and Rory, who's 9 and is a chaos agent in the very best sense. The money. 11 years ago, fall of 2012, Declan's agency was 8 months from folding. He'd taken a big office lease on King Street West, hired a head of the revenue, lost his anchor client in August. Classic. He drove down to Pictou in October and sat in my kitchen and told me it was a timing issue about 4 times. Marion let him say it 4 times. Then she asked him the actual number. He told her. She wrote it on the back of a grocery receipt. And then she did something I have thought about every day since. She didn't offer him money. She said, "Where's the office?" He told her. King Street West, 2nd floor above a print shop, in a building that in 2012 was surrounded by a parking lot, a payday loan storefront, and about 15 years of deferred maintenance. Marion looked at me across our kitchen table. 41 years does a thing where you don't need to say it out loud. We'd sold a parcel of land on the eastern end of the property that spring. We were sitting on the proceeds. We bought that building in Toronto, as an investment. I want to be precise about that, because it's the part that made everything work the way it did. We didn't buy it for Declan. We bought it because that block was going to come back and anyone who'd spent time in Toronto over the previous 20 years could see it. And we set up a numbered company, 0847 Holdings Inc. And we leased the 2nd floor to Northmark Creative at what was, in 2012, a fair market rate. And then we never raised it. 11 years. King Street West went from a parking lot to a coffee roaster, 2 restaurants, a climbing gym, and a film production company. Commercial rents in that stretch went up 290%. Declan's rent went up nothing because Marion handled it, and Marion's instruction to the property manager was 1 sentence. Keep it where it is. By 2023, my son was paying about 35 cents on the dollar for that floor. I ran the number with my accountant last spring out of pure curiosity. Over 11 years, the difference between what Declan paid and what the space was actually worth came to just under $870,000. $870,000 quietly handed to a man who had been telling his wife's book club that he'd been helping his father manage his finances since Mom passed. He didn't know. That was the entire design. Because Marion said it that night in our kitchen. She said, "Roy, if he knows, he'll never believe he built it himself. Let him have that. Let him have that." She was protecting him. That's what she thought she was doing. And I went along with it. And I have spent 2 years on the other side of all this thinking we were wrong. Not malicious, but wrong. I'll say more about that at the end because I think a lot of you are doing the same thing for someone right now, and you're going to recognize it. Marion died April 2022. The first month Declan was present. He came down 2 weekends, fixed a gate on the equipment shed badly, and I let him. Then it started, small at first, the way these things always start small. 2 months after we buried his mother, "Dad, we should think about the long-term plan for the property." 4 months. "Dad, are you actually okay out there by yourself?" 7 months. "Dad, we can't restructure our whole lives around you needing company." I hadn't asked him for a single thing. Not once. I came to Toronto 3 times that year. Every time it was to see the grandkids. Every time I brought a cooler of lobster. Every time I stayed under 2 hours. But somewhere in there, Declan had built a version of me. A version that was coming apart. And once you build a version of somebody, everything they do confirms it. I called and I was lonely. I didn't call and I was withdrawing. I fixed my own roof at 66 and I was being reckless. I hired it done and I was declining. There is no move you can make against a version of yourself that someone else has already constructed. You just live in it and let them narrate. And then he started telling people. I was at Hazel's 12th birthday party in their backyard. I went upstairs to use the bathroom, and coming back down the hallway I heard Declan on the back deck with two men I didn't know. He said, and I want to give you the exact words because they are the exact words. Honestly, at this point, I'm basically managing two households. I stood at the top of those stairs and I did not move. Here is the thing I have never said out loud until right now. My first feeling was not anger, it was embarrassment. For about 4 seconds I stood in my son's hallway and I thought, is he right? Is there something he knows that I don't? That's what it does to you. Someone tells a story about you confidently enough, and for a few seconds you'll check your own pockets. Then I remembered the building. Later that afternoon, Beverly, Gillian's mother, put her hand on my arm at the drinks table and said, Declan is such a good son, Roy. You're lucky to have him. I looked at that woman and I said, so I hear. 2 words, and I let it stand. Things got worse in September. I drove up to Toronto to sign some things at my lawyer's office. Gary Tran works out of Markham. I stopped at the house to drop off a cooler of late-season lobster for the kids. Declan was in the kitchen with the door half open on a call. He didn't hear me on the porch. I heard him say to whoever was on the line, no, realistically, the Pictou property is the asset. He's not going to be up there much longer. And honestly, between us, I don't think he's tracking things the way he used to. I set the cooler on the porch. I got back in my truck. I drove the 401 in the dark for 3 hours and I did not turn the radio on once. When I got home, I went down to the wharf and spent 3 hours mending trap by myself with a work light hooked to the shed door. That's what I do when I nad my hands doing something correct. I called Gary the next morning, pulled the numbers, the building, the rent history, both columns side by side on one page. Every year Northmark Creative had posted any kind of gain. It had been a gain smaller than the gap between what Declan paid and what the floor was worth. Not 1 year. Gary said, do you want my read on this or just the numbers? I said both. He said, Roy, without that building there's no agency. I sat with that for a long time. The call from Willa came on a Thursday. She doesn't do preamble. She said, Dad, Declan called me. He's talking about a capacity assessment. In Ontario, under the Substitute Decisions Act, if someone asserts that a person can no longer manage their own property, they can initiate a formal assessment of capacity. It's a serious thing. It means a legal process that can remove your right to make your own financial decisions. Declan had told Willa he was concerned about my erratic financial behavior, specifically, the land I'd sold in 2012 to fund the building purchase. He said, Mom's passing had affected my judgment more than the family wanted to admit, and that they needed to be proactive. Willa said, what do you want me to do? I said, what did you tell him? She said, I told him to go to hell, then I hung up and called you. I was standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Marion wrote a number on the back of a grocery receipt 12 years ago. Everything went very quiet and very orderly, the way it does on the water when the weather's turning, and you've got maybe 10 minutes to make a decision before you lose the option entirely. Because here is the thing. Up until Willa's phone call, I had believed Declan was scared. Scared of what he'd built coming apart. Scared of what he'd owe me if the truth came out. Scared people do ugly things and you can come back from scared. I would have walked all the way to Toronto to help him come back from scared. This wasn't scared. This was a plan. This was my son choosing between telling his wife the truth and initiating a legal process to have his father declared financially incapable, and sitting down somewhere and choosing the second one. That's not a crack in the wood. That's rot you find after you've pulled the board, and it's already 3 feet deeper than where you started looking. I called Gary the next morning. I said, send the non-renewal notice. The lease on the King Street building had been rolling on annual renewals. Under the terms, written notice from the landlord ended it at the January 31st mark. Gary was quiet a moment. Then he said, Roy, if this goes out, his business doesn't survive the year. I said, Gary, it hasn't survived any of the last 11. He just doesn't know it yet. The notice went out. Last day of lobster season is the last Saturday of November. That year I did something I had never done before and will not do again. And it is the thing I actually want to tell you about. Everything up until now has been set up. I invited them all. Declan and Gillian and Beverly. Willa flew in from Kelowna, which cost her 2 days and a last-minute fare, and she didn't mention either. My cousin Archie, who'd patted me on the shoulder at Hazel's birthday party and told me how generous Declan was. Shirley, who had been there the morning Marion died. And Hazel and Rory, which I thought about for a long time, and some of you are going to disagree with that choice. I'll take that. Declan came because he thought I was going to walk it back. Gillian told me this afterward. She said he told her in the car on the way down, he hates confrontation. He'll have found a way to soften this. 40 years and that was what he had on me. My processing shed is 48 feet long, steel-sided concrete floor built by my father in 1967. On the last day of season it smells like nothing else on earth. Cold salt air, wet rope, motor oil, and the particular iron smell of a good run coming to its end. When they came through the roll door at 11:30, I had the grading table running. On purpose, all of it. I wanted them to walk into my work, not my kitchen. Declan came in wearing a Canada Goose jacket that had never been closer to a boat than a Yorkville showroom. Beverly was holding her coat closed like the shed was going to get on her. Hazel went straight for the catch bins. She always goes for the bins. I let them stand for about 90 seconds while I finished what I was doing. 90 seconds is a long time in a noisy room when nobody knows what to do with their hands. Then I walked to the switch panel and I cut the motor. The table wound down with that low descending groan machinery makes when it stops, and then the shed went into the specific enormous silence of something loud that has just ended. I climbed down off the platform at 67. That takes a moment, and I let it take a moment, and I said, "Thanks for coming out." Then I told them everything, standing there with salt on my jacket and rope marks on my hands. I told them about 2012 and the kitchen table and the grocery receipt. I told them the address on King Street West. I told them the numbered company. I told them 11 years, and I told them the number, $870,000 in below market rent. I watched that number move around that shed like a dropped anchor. Beverly's face. I'm not going to be gracious about what I felt when I said the number, and watched Beverly Ashford's expression change. There was something in me that is not proud of itself, and was there anyway. Gillian already knew. I'd called her the Friday before, because she had a right to know before she walked into that room. She had made Declan tell her everything that night. That is the clearest thing anybody did in this entire story, and she did it without anyone asking her to. I told them what Marion had said. Let him have that. And I said, out loud, the thing I'd been carrying for 2 years. That was our mistake, hers and mine. We thought we were protecting him. What we actually did was hand a man a business and let him believe he'd built it himself, and then stand around confused when he started treating the people who handed it to him like they were a problem to be managed. Declan was looking at the floor. I said, 3 weeks ago I came to your door with 15 minutes of talking to do. I was going to tell you every word of what I just said, sitting down, just the two of us, no one watching. And you told me to leave before Gillian got home. He said quietly, I was under a lot of pressure that night. I said, I know. That's why I called Gary the next morning. And his head came up. I said, you want to tell everyone what you asked your sister to do, or should I let her? Willa said from over by the door, I'll do it. And she told them. Declan had contacted her asking for support in initiating a capacity assessment, to put it in writing that their father was not fit to manage his own financial affairs. Gillian made a sound I will not describe. She hadn't known that part. He'd told her about the building on Friday night. He had not told her that. Beverly said, Declan, is that true? My son stood in my processing shed on the last day of season, with his hands in the pockets of a jacket that had never seen a working day, and he did not answer. That was the answer. I looked at my son standing there, and I saw him at 16 in that same shed, watching a buyer from Halifax be patiently condescending to his father, deciding in that moment that he would be anything on earth before he let himself be looked at that way. And I understood him, not excused him. Understood, because the world does do that. It looks at the coat and the truck and the hands, and it decides what you're worth. And Declan watched it happen to me, and it burned into him, and he spent 20 years building a version of himself that could never be talked down to. The problem is he built it out of appearances, and once appearances become the entire structure, anyone who threatens the appearance becomes a threat to the life, including your own father, in a wet jacket, at your front door. That is not evil. I want to be careful about that because it is easy to make him a monster, and he isn't one. He made a category error at 16 and he never went back to check it. He decided that because I look like what I am is lesser, and once you have decided that about someone, everything you do to them stops feeling like cruelty and starts feeling like management. I said, the non-renewal went out. The lease ends January 31st. I'm not taking your company. I own a building and I've stopped subsidizing it. That's all that's happened. Declan said, you're destroying 11 years of my work. I'd had 2 weeks to find the right sentence, so I'm going to give you the exact words. Son, if my signature is the only thing holding it up, it was never a business. It was a project I was funding. He came forward one step and he said flat and quiet, you've been controlling me for 11 years and I didn't even know it. And I said, that's fair. That stopped him cold. I said, it's genuinely fair, Declan. You didn't consent to any of it. Your mother and I decided what was good for you, and we did it behind your back for more than a decade, and you never had a say in any of it. That's a real grievance, and you can hold it as long as you need to. Then I said, and it doesn't touch what you asked your sister to do. He had nothing for that. Hazel had been standing by the catch bins the whole time. I want to say that plainly. She heard every word of it. And when it was over, when everyone was standing in a stopped shed not knowing where to look, my granddaughter walked the full length of that building past her father and came and stood next to me. She put her hand on the edge of the grading table. She was 13 years old and she just stood there without saying anything. I have pulled trap in December gales. I have not slept in 2 days during a good run. I have carried things. But that, a 13-year-old walking past her father to stand next to her grandfather in a processing shed on the last day of season, that undid me more than anything in the previous month. Because that was the lesson getting corrected in front of everyone who needed to see it corrected. By a kid who had worked it out entirely on her own. Here's what happened after, and I'm going to say it plainly because I'm not going to lie to you for a cleaner ending. Northmark Creative did not fold. Declan moved out of the King Street building in February. He let 2 people go, which I know cost him something real because one of them had been there since year 1. He and Gillian refinanced their mortgage. He moved the agency into a smaller space in Leslieville. It's still running. It's smaller, and for the first time it is actually his. Gillian stayed. That surprised people, including me. She told me over the phone in the spring, I'm not leaving over money, I'm staying to see what he does about it. That is the clearest thing I have ever heard anyone say about a marriage. Beverly has not spoken to me since November. I'll survive. Willa flew back to Kelowna 3 days after the shed. She called me from the airport. She said, he's an idiot, but he's my brother Dad. I said, I know. She said, are you okay? I said, getting there. She said, get there faster, that's Willa. Declan drove down to Pictou in May, alone. Old Honda Civic, 9 years on it, a dent in the rear quarter he hadn't bothered with. He stood in the yard and said, can I come out on the boat with you? For a couple of seconds I thought about saying no. I want you to know that. I stood in my own driveway and I genuinely considered it. I'm not ashamed of that. It meant I wasn't simply rolling over. I said, get the extra gloves out of the shed. We went out. 4 hours. He pulled some trap. He wasn't good at it, but he didn't perform not being good at it, which was its own kind of improvement. We didn't talk much. On the water you don't have to. Out past the breakwater with the motor cut, he said, one thing I'll give you. I don't know how much of what I built is real, Dad. I've never once operated without you underneath it, and now I don't know. I said, nobody does until they have to. You find out by doing the next 20 years. We came in around 4. He helped wash down the boat. He shook my hand at his car the way a man shakes your hand when he's settling something, and it was exactly right. We're not huggers, never have been. Now the last thing, the tackle box. Declan asked me about it in May, standing at his car before he left. He said, Dad, that night, what was under the folder? He had never looked. 3 weeks that tackle box sat on his back porch in Toronto and then in his garage, and on a Friday morning he read the folder at his kitchen table and called me, and he never lifted it. I went inside and got it from the drawer. I brought it out and opened it in front of him. Under the folder was Marion's gardening notebook. Spiral bound, 20 years of it, her handwriting on every page. And folded into the back cover was a hand-drawn map of the Pictou property in her handwriting. Up on the north slope, behind the tree line, she'd drawn a rough outline around 8 acres. She'd been planting sugar maples there since 2008. She had been doing it quietly, 1 trip to the nursery at a time, the way she did most things that mattered. Inside the outline she had written 2 words. Northmark Grove. She'd been calling it that for years, well before Declan ever chose that word for his agency. He chose it because he liked the sound of it. Because it felt like something rooted and real. And his mother, 800 kilometers away in a field in Nova Scotia, had been planting the same idea into the ground 1 maple at a time since he was 29 years old. She told me, about a year before she died, that she wanted those 8 acres to be his, not because he'd earned them. She was very clear about that. She said, it's the one thing we've got that can't be invoiced, Roy. He'll never be able to buy this one. The Grove tapped its first spring in 2024. 11 liters. They're in my shed right now. Declan stood in the yard reading his mother's handwriting for a long time. Then he looked up and neither of us said anything, and that was right too. All right, here's what I've come to, and then I'll let you go. Most people think the danger is being disrespected. It isn't. Disrespect is loud and you can answer it. The danger is being concluded. Someone looks at your coat, your truck, your hands, and they decide what you are, and then they stop looking. After that, nothing you do can reach them because everything gets filed under the conclusion they already made. Work hard and you're being stubborn. Rest and you're declining. Show up and you want something. Declan concluded me when he was 16 years old in my own processing shed, watching a man from Halifax tell me what my catch was worth. And I let him because I never said the sentence. I stood there and I took that number, and I said nothing to my son afterward. I stood at the top of his staircase at his daughter's birthday party and heard him tell strangers he was carrying 2 households, and I told myself silence was dignity. It wasn't dignity, it was avoidance wearing a work jacket. So here's the one thing I'd ask you to do this week, and it costs you nothing but about 90 seconds of discomfort. The next time someone says something about you that isn't true, small, the kind you'd normally let go because correcting it would be awkward, say quietly and without heat. That's not actually what happened. Just once, just one. You don't have to win the moment. You just have to not confirm it by saying nothing. Because I let 11 of them go, and by the end my own son was on the phone to his sister using the word incapable. And here's the question I want you to sit with before you answer it fast. Who in your life have you concluded, and when did you last actually check? Not who's wronged you, who have you filed? There's someone, there always is. Leave me a number in the comments. Comment 1 if you think I was right sending the non-renewal. No warning, let him find the floor, that's what it takes. Comment 2 if you think I should have restructured the lease, 5 years to walk up to market rate, because he's my son and blood buys at least one more chance than that. Or comment 3 if you think the whole thing broke in 2012 in my kitchen, when Marion said let him have that. And everything that came after was just the bill arriving on a Tuesday night in November. I know where I land, I'm not saying it yet. I want to see where you all fall first, because I have been wrong about my own family before. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Last month someone rode in from Whitehorse at 5 in the morning before a shift start. And someone else from the BC ferry between Victoria and Savasin. And I sat in the shed office with the space heater going, reading those for the better part of an hour. I don't know how you found a fisherman from Pictou County, but I'm glad you did. If someone in your life has decided what you are and stopped checking. If you've ever stood in a doorway while the room behind it went quiet, tell me about it. There are a lot more of us than anyone lets on. If this one meant something to you, do me the one favor. Hit subscribe and stick around. There's another one coming. I've been sitting on it a while because I wanted to get the last part right. And those 8 acres up on the north slope, they're still just the north block on any map that means anything. Declan asked about making the name official. I told him he has to put in 1 full tapping season first, start to finish, by hand. This past April he drove down and worked 4 days without being asked twice about anything. His hands were wrecked by day 2 and he didn't mention it once. We'll see. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully reimagined and rewritten to create original content. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental.